listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is the podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rodri Davis, and this week is the fifth of our partnership with the European Research Network on Philanthropy, or ERNOP. So ERNOP every quarter put out a series of research notes, which are kind of short, 1 to 2 page, practitioner-focused précis or summaries of recent academic work in philanthropy, and they're written by kind of practitioners who've read the research themselves. And every time ERNOP does one of these, I talk to 3 of the academics who've brought out work that was in the most recent release of research notes to find out a bit about what their work's about and kind of what value it has for practitioners, and also just talk a bit more broadly about how we get better links between philanthropy and practice. So we've got another set of great interviewees for this edition. We have Arthur Gautier up first, then we have Isabel de Bruin, and finally we have Janis Petzinger. I'll give a bit more sort of detailed biographical information on each of those before we go into the interview section with them. And then I will be back at the end of the podcast for just a little bit of housekeeping and tell you where you can find out more information about the things that we discuss. So, without further ado, let's get into the interviews. And up first, we have Arthur Gautier. Now, Arthur is an associate professor at ESSEC Business School and executive director of the ESSEC Philanthropy Chair. So he's based in France. And his paper, which is really interesting, is called Making Sense of Hybrid Practices, the Role of Individual Adherence to Institutional Logics in Impact Investing. Or, if you want the title of the research note based on it, which maybe gives you slightly clearer flavour of what the whole thing's about. That's called The Role of People's Life Stories When Making Sense of Impact Investing as an alternative to either charitable giving or traditional investing. So that's very much what Arthur and I talked about. So without further ado, let's hear from Arthur. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Arthur Gautier. Hi there, Arthur.
Hi, Rodri. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, great to talk to you too. We're here for one of the ERNOP partnership episodes to talk about a paper that you have featured in the latest release of research notes or write-up of the paper. It'd be really great just to hear a bit in your own words about what the paper was about, what some of the key findings were in it.
The paper is about people involved in philanthropy and or impact investing. So we had the chance to access clients of a private bank, so wealthy clients that have significant activity for the others. So either through investments for social or environmental projects or philanthropy or both. And what we wanted to do in this paper is try to understand why some of these clients, when introduced to impact investing, which we understand, as the investments in funds or social enterprises that try to combine both a financial return and a social return on investment. So we were trying to understand why some of these clients were really enthused by the idea of combining, in a sense, finance and philanthropy through this hybrid practice, as we call it. Why some of them were enthused, while others were really critical of the idea, or they did not really understand what it was about. So we really wanted to understand. That was our initial puzzle, and we wanted to go in depth about that. So we did some live story interviews with a sample of clients of this bank, and we interviewed them 3 times over a course of 3 years. So we were really able to develop trust and deep connections with them on their journey, where most of them had an entrepreneurial journey, made their wealth through a business. Some of them inherited their wealth as well, which was an interesting contrast. And then what we try to do in this paper is to understand what could explain the mechanism leading to either adopting impact investing or rejecting it, or for some of them even ignoring it. So that's the baseline of the paper. You want me to talk about findings, I guess? So,
well, yeah, just to I'd love to hear from you. I guess for me, the takeaway, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that one of the sort of surprising things or counterintuitive things and the key finding in it was actually for those high net worth individuals you spoke to who had either no previous knowledge at all about either one of the domains, or for those who had quite a significant level, that seemed to not work that well. What was the sort of Goldilocks zone? Were those people who knew a bit about either or both, enough to be kind of comfortable, but they were sort of more willing to think a bit more flexibly? Is that sort of fair summation?
Yeah, exactly. So, in a sense, in this paper, we view impact investing as some sort of a hybrid between traditional giving and traditional investments. And if you have no knowledge at all about finance or investments, well, impact investing will sound, a little unusual to you. You may not understand what it is about. And the same if you have zero, connection or interest in the field of impact, broadly speaking, which includes philanthropy as well. So these people did not really see, what this hybrid practice was combining, because they were either completely novice in finance or in philanthropy. And on the other hand, you're right. Some people who were extremely knowledgeable and what we call in the paper emotionally attached with the logics of finance, for instance, these people, when they viewed impact investing first as a financial activity, like as an alternative to traditional asset management, they opposed it because they thought, well, if impact investing is asking me to not maximize the return on investment, if it means adopting another standard to measure success, I'm lost. I don't understand it. And what is, below market return? It doesn't exist. To me, I want to maximize my return. I cannot fathom, this idea of a diminished return. I prefer to maximize my financial return in traditional investments and then do philanthropy. These two worlds, they are connected through financial, flows, but they have different logics, and I don't want to blend any of it. So this was an interesting finding, and it was a bit the same for some people who were, religious people who were attached to the logic of pure charity and asking nothing in return when they make a gift. And for them, they were completely attached to the logic of charity and pure philanthropy, and they also opposed impact investing because to them it was a way to taint the purity of their intentions with this idea of having something back, having the capital back. And so these people were really interesting because they opposed impact investing because it was not as pure as their vision of either mainstream finance or mainstream philanthropy. And you're right, those in the middle, those people who had some experience, some knowledge, but that were not, professional finance people or really, believers of pure giving, those were able to navigate this hybrid sphere and to see impact investing as an interesting activity to explore.
And did you get a sense in those people, the sort of the rejection of the less familiar or the unfamiliar logic that people were presented with, if they were coming from the investment end or if they were coming from the philanthropy end? It feels like going through some of the more detailed case studies in the paper as though in some cases it's that they didn't understand it in the sense of they just didn't really quite get their heads around the concepts. Whereas you say in other cases, perhaps for those where they had, religious views that played a part, they did understand the idea of impact investing. They just kind of rejected the underlying logic. Were there any kind of distinctions to be drawn between the different ways in which people perhaps didn't understand it, whether it was a kind of lack of ability to grasp the concept or whether they did, but they just didn't believe that it was a kind of meaningful thing?
It's a really great point, Rodri. So what we called, the novices, the people who actually ignore the practice are the ones who don't really grasp how things go together, Those who reject it, I think they understand what impact investing proposes, but they don't view it as appropriate. They question the legitimacy of this practice. So we had a few professional investors in a sample, so people who made their wealth either through stock brokering or turnaround investments or private equity. And these guys were really interesting because when they hear the word investing, a red light flashes, they view impact investing as some sort of deficient investment activities because of this lack of, standard way to measure performance and in many cases below market returns. But the same guys, if they understood impact investing as, for instance, an alternative to charitable giving with this idea of, reusing, grants eternally in a way, they probably would not have reacted this way. They probably say, oh, wait, why not, doing something, more efficient with the same sum of money instead of just giving one time. But since they reacted to the word investing as professional investors, they were really, not comfortable with the practice. And I would say that's the main difference. So to me, both the professional investors and I would say the religious donors in our sample, they reacted in a way. They viewed impact investing as a illegitimate practice because it was not as pure as their ideal for either investments or giving, and they rejected it for these reasons because they opposed this. But what is important in the paper is what do you compare impact investing to actually?
And related to that, I don't know if it's not something I think that you cover explicitly in the paper, but I wondered how the findings in the paper might relate to what it seems to me is one of the kind of the big questions out there about impact investing in relation to philanthropy, which is whether it is genuinely something that's additive, so it enlarges the overall volume of resources available for doing social good, or whether in some sense it is cannibalizing philanthropy because it's eating into money that otherwise might have been given in the form of donations and grants. Does this paper sort of shed any light on that or provide avenues for thinking about it?
That's an excellent point. I think this is something that's maybe in the background of our paper. I remember two cases. So in one case, a woman who has created a large foundation with her husband in the protection of the environment. Well, to her, impact investing was interesting because it was a way to try helping people on the ground and social entrepreneurs. It was a way for her to try something different than just a grant. So she was not canceling the grants. She was just adding a new tool in her toolbox to support the mission of the foundation. So for her, it was really additive and a way to try something new to support projects. But for others, I remember a case, a man in this in our sample. To him, he refused impact investing because to him it was a way to cannibalize philanthropy, and he was afraid that wealthy people like him, would be probably seduced by impact investing and would cancel their traditional giving altogether. And he was afraid of that. And it's true that some people do. A third man in our sample who was a young entrepreneur, he took over the family business and he also developed new activities. And he was also, a bit disgusted by some of the practices of some charities that his mother was supporting. So for him, impact investing was, the new grail in a sense, and he wanted to give up both, mainstream investments and also traditional giving. And for him, he was trying to follow the example of Charles and Lisa Kleisner, for instance, who wanted to dedicate 100% of their assets to impact. And he was trying to follow their lead and this goal. And to him, it was also a way to say, you know what? I think I'm done with charitable giving. I prefer to do impact investing. So yes, I guess there is a risk of cannibalizing, but it's really different for each person, I would say.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. I just want to zoom out a bit and think about the sort of wider context for philanthropy, academia and practice, because obviously one of the focuses of the ERNOP Research Notes series is to try and bridge that gap. It sounds like the work you're doing, certainly in that paper, is has a very healthy dose of being practice focused, or would be, the clear relevance to practice. What is your experience and sense of the sort of current state of links between academia and philanthropy and practice? Have you found it easy to kind of maintain those links, or do you find there's a challenge in kind of getting the work you're doing out to a practitioner audience?
Well, there is a challenge, and we've tried to address the challenge since we created the ESSEC Philanthropy Chair, more than 12 years ago. One of our goals in this center really is to try to bridge the gap between philanthropy professionals, especially those in France, and philanthropy research. And we are very glad that ERNOP is now doing initiatives at the European level to do that, because this is what we've done, for France for years now. And there is actually a challenge because the academic researchers are not incentivized to do research that is understandable and meaningful for practitioners. We are incentivized to develop new theory through our empirical cases. Of course, practitioners are interested in research that could be used in their daily operations, for instance, either to transform their practices or to inspire them to think differently about challenges. So I think there is a window to really make research that is relevant for practitioners. But the incentives are just not there yet, even though things are improving a little bit. I think now in business schools, professors are also evaluated, it's the case at ESSEC Business School, on their impact on the outside world, I would say, so outside of the ivory tower. We are evaluated in, the way in which we intervene in professional conferences, our visibility in the media. Mm-hmm. And this usually is connected to our research, because if, our legitimacy is to study philanthropic phenomena with an academic and scientific approach. So we don't want to promote it. We want to study it. And I think it's going in the right direction, but more good incentives need to be invented, I think, both by academic institutions and also by the media or practitioners themselves. And I'm really happy that ERNOP and actors like Philea are collaborating more in this regard. I feel less alone than I was 12 years ago, and I think it's going in the right direction. But we need energy and incentives to continue to bring people together, to translate the problems and the jargon in both worlds into something that is understandable and useful, at least to get new perspectives on what we do. And I think it's amazing to do that. I'm really happy in this, trying to connect practitioners to researchers and the other way around. And I think it's really important. And Rodri, what you do in your podcast is really contributing to this. So thank you also to you.
Oh, well, it's very kind of you. And yeah, just finally, it'd be really interesting to hear a little bit about what you're working on now, because I know often the papers actually take quite a while to come out.
Several years. Yeah,
we're talking about something that you were working on 3 or 4 years ago at least. So what is it that you're focusing on at the moment?
There are several projects. I will only mention 2 maybe. So I'm currently doing an ethnography in a corporate foundation in France, trying to understand how the decisions to fund or not to fund projects that are, identified and assessed by the foundation are actually taken. I'm trying to open the black box of the decision-making process to understand who's doing what beyond, the official, boards or the official reports. So this is something in which we really lack research, how foundation boards or committees actually decide, and what is the part of rationality, emotions, reputation, and also the role of invisible people. The staff of some of these foundations who do an amazing work, and they are not necessarily mentioned in all the glossy reports. So this is what I'm trying to do. It's an ethnography. It's really focusing, spending time with the staff, trying to see what they do on a daily basis, doing their work myself, helping them sort through projects and understand the process, how it works, what is the difference between the official discourse and the reality of the job. So that's a cool project I'm working on right now. And I could go on for hours,
No, I mean, that's a tantalizing glimpse. It sounds absolutely fascinating. I think, as you say, getting to lifting the lid a bit on the life of philanthropoids and how that sort of thing actually works would be absolutely fascinating. So I really look forward to seeing that when it's out. And just remains to say thank you ever so much for finding the time to come on the podcast. Great to hear about the work that you're doing, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk in more depth at some point in the future.
Yes, Rodri, I would be happy to. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, then. Well, my thanks again to Arthur for coming on the podcast. It was really great to have a chance to talk to him. It's very much one of those people that I've been kind of aware of for a long time, and I think similarly the other way around, but we've never managed to meet, so it was great to have a chance to chat. Next up, we have Isabel de Bruin. Now, Isabel, she is a PhD candidate currently in Rotterdam School of Management at Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And her paper, which is really fascinating, and I think will have a lot of resonance, certainly with anyone who works in the international NGO space, is called How Moral Goodness Drives Unethical Behaviour, Empirical Evidence for the NGO Halo Effect. So yeah, we're very much talking about that idea that sometimes the conviction that you're doing good or working for a good organisation can lead to problematic behaviour. So without further ado, let's go into that conversation, and I will be back again afterwards. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Isabel de Bruin. Hi there, Isabel.
Hi, Rodri.
Well, great to have you on the podcast, and really looking forward to talking about the paper that you've got featured in the most recent ERNOP Research Notes series, all about the idea of the NGO halo effect and looking at some of the empirical evidence behind that idea, which I think people will find really fascinating. So maybe the best place to start is just for you to say a bit about what the paper is actually all about and what the key findings were in it.
Sure. Well, this paper is part of my dissertation, which I defended a little bit less than a month ago. But this specific paper that you're referring to is qualitative evidence that we generated based on interviews to show what a halo effect within NGOs looks like, and also to correlate a halo with unethical behavior. So the initial premise is trying to make sense of why NGOs as perceived good organizations can behave unethically. And of course, my research is not the first or the only one to try and make sense of this phenomenon. But the factors that have been used to explain unethical behavior in NGOs before are quite generic. So in other words, these factors have also been used to explain unethical behavior, let's say, in businesses, governments. And then I thought, what makes NGOs a distinct type of organization? And I looked at this perception of moral goodness that is there amongst our sector in general. I mean, the literature also speaks to that. Like when an NGO is categorized as an NGO, it generally gets a label as a good organization. And I should say, when I say NGO, I mean it to be synonymous to charity, voluntary association. So I thought, okay, can we indeed look at this perception of moral goodness alongside unethical behavior? Is it paradoxical? So with that framework, I decided to make sense of whether the two can be related, and I find that they can indeed. So I find that particularly when there is a sense of a mission, the morals behind the mission, as well as the people within the NGO being considered as good. And when I'm talking about being considered as good by the people in the NGO, so it's staff, the volunteers, anybody that is working within the context of the NGO, there can be a tendency for the glorification of this goodness. And by the glorification, I mean then the idealization or the prioritization of these mission, morals, and people. And when that I define as a halo effect, this glorification. And once that glorification is there, I find then that unethical behavior can be rationalized, motivated, or ignored. And through these interviews, I try and show what does this glorification look like. So some interviewees, for example, talk about their NGO's mission as their life calling. Some of them talk about their mission as the embodiment of their moral identity. So in other words, this mission goes over and beyond just a typical 9 to 5. It's a living part of who people are. Also relating, for example, to people, colleagues aren't necessarily referred to just as colleagues. They're referred to as inherently trustworthy, angelic, sanctified. So looking at these elements then of glorification, and then also looking at the examples of unethical behavior that respondents measure or identified during the interviews, I try to make sense of whether indeed we can associate them together. And I find that there are several mechanisms that can be activated. So if the mission is glorified, it can lead to this tendency of moral justification. It's almost like ends justifies the means mentality. So if the mission is prioritized above other considerations in the organization, people in the organization can say, well, regardless of what we do to meet the mission, we will consider it to be good because the mission is so brilliant. The same holds for people, for example. If there is a sense that people are inherently trustworthy, inherently good, they can be prioritized over ethics management, like your safeguarding policies or your codes of conduct. I call this moral naivete, where people are, how should I say, trusted or prioritized over the rules and regulations that their organization has. And with respect to morals, if people within the NGO consider their morals to be better than, for example, legal norms or social norms, there can be a tendency for moral superiority, where people in the organization then feel licensed to trump others' norms, considering their norms to be better.
Yeah, I thought this was really fascinating. There's a couple of things I wanted to pick up on. I guess taking that one of the moral naivety first. I mean, so essentially the argument there is because people, I mean, perhaps because they're working as volunteers, or there's some sense that they've chosen a mission-driven occupation and maybe compromised on kind of financial compensation as a result. This all adds to a sense that they must be good. So we don't need to monitor people's behavior as much as you might need to in other contexts, because surely we're all good people. And I think anyone who has, worked in the NGO sector or sort of, observed it from the outside will know that doesn't always hold true. And you do get wrongdoing. I'd be really interested in what your sense is of whether, when there is wrongdoing, the extent to which people genuinely are good in one dimension of themselves, in that they are committed to a mission, and it's not that they're overtly using that to mask wrongdoing in another sense, although that may be the case in some areas. Is it just that there's a certain kind of difference of mental accounting, so that people are identifying their sense of moral worth that comes from having chosen to work in a certain sort of organization, and then that makes them kind of less able to be self-reflective about the other ways in which they might be acting in a way that is more morally or ethically dubious, or is it more conscious? Do people sort of make slightly more conscious trade-offs?
I think it comes back to how we as individuals relate also to others within the organization, and as how we also relate to the NGO that we work with. Because generally speaking, we work in a context where the organization's norms or morals align with our own. So we also assume that our colleagues have similar norms to ours. So if indeed colleagues don't act according to our expectations, because we all have expectations that, okay, if we all are in it together, we kind of expect us to behave in the same way as well. And if we see that that doesn't happen, it also asks bigger questions on ourselves. We reflect on ourselves, but he or she or they are not necessarily behaving according to what I thought. What does this mean then for my own identity? So there becomes a bit of a cognitive dissonance at play, where it becomes psychologically easier to downplay somebody's behavior that's not in line with your expectations, or simply to ignore it. So that also came up quite strongly during the interviews, when incidences have been reported either by outsiders or people within the organization. There can be a tendency to think, well, at the end of the day, that person is good because they are bound by the same set of norms and morals that are pushing us to work towards this mission. Let's give them another chance. Even if the safeguarding policy, for example, says, well, according to this behavior, these are the repercussions. Yeah, well, you were talking about this element of compromise. There is, generally speaking, a sense of sacrifice. Working with NGOs, we give up some salary cuts, or we give up elements of our time without necessarily getting anything in return. So there is that inherent sense of goodness to begin with, but that's even more perpetuated within the organization because people have aligned value base.
And it was really interesting what you were saying there. So in a sense, above and beyond the fact that the moral naivety or some of these other dimensions might facilitate wrongdoing in the first place, also at an institutional level, they might limit the effectiveness of trying to deal with it, because people essentially sort of say, maybe the people in HR are also bought into the idea that the organization itself is good. And so they are, consciously or not, less willing to entertain the idea that people are acting out of character or kind of engaging in misdeeds, because that would affect their own view of themselves and the organization that they've chosen to work for. Is that something that you saw through the interviews as well?
Yes. And it's interesting also that you point out HR specifically, because this is also something that came out during recruitment procedures. If it is seen that that person comes from a like-minded organization previously, for example, there's already this tendency to think, okay, they are one of us. They know how we think, they know how we behave. So there might be less of a tendency to do rigid checks and balances beforehand. Or there might also be less of a tendency to do these induction trainings with the expectation that we are all together, we are already all a team. So I think this finding does have implications for how we look at recruitment. Also, one of the unethical behaviors, the top 3 examples of unethical behavior that we identified during these interviews was indeed faulty recruitment practices through nepotism, favoritism, especially because of the tendencies to think, well, they're one of us, so they must be good, so we trust them, so we don't expect them to break our trust or to behave counter to our expectations.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, something I wanted to ask about the different types of wrongdoing or kind of unethical behavior you'd identified. To what extent, or kind of what was the breakdown of those different types in terms of things that related perhaps to the relationship between organizations and recipients or the communities they're working with, as opposed to ones that were internal to the organization? Because I would assume there were examples of both there, but I'd be interested to know which were more prevalent or which were seen to be more problematic.
Sure. We identified 6 different categories, and I should also disclaim here that these were respondents' perceptions of unethical behavior. So we did not necessarily look at any case files. That was beyond the scope of this research. So it was really their perceptions. We find discrimination to be up there, discrimination based on gender, race. We find also financial mismanagement, cover-up as well of unethical behavior. By cover-up, I mean either the unethical behavior not being taken as seriously as the code of conduct would indicate for it to be, going against best practice. So if there are, for example, standards or guidelines or research advocating for a particular program to be or not be a certain way, then the NGO going counter to that. This ties into the sense of moral superiority. And some of these unethical behaviors, like you said, are different based on the stakeholders. So some of these unethical behaviors are indeed vis-a-vis the beneficiary or the target group. Some of them are also vis-a-vis staff members internally, but it could also be vis-a-vis donors. So grant mismanagement, for example, looked at how some data can be manipulated in order to show to the donor that the NGO is having a greater impact than it might be having. But it could also be a reflection of, donors have this expectation that, let's say, out of your €1 invested, 90 cents goes into the beneficiaries. But an organization, of course, needs money to operate. Ethics also costs money. So manipulating the data, and I say that between quotes, to show to the donor, yes, your money is being used for beneficiaries, but not necessarily articulating that the money is also being used for operating costs, is also an example to show how NGOs can engage in unethical practice. Of course, it raises the question: unethical for who? For the NGO, it is survival, because you need the money to be able to survive in order to conduct your programs to meet your mission. But the donor might be the one that's considered to be unethical, because you're not fully transparently reporting on how their money is being implemented.
Yeah, and I can imagine lots of organizations will have found themselves in that situation, and I'd imagine lots of them could imagine scenarios in which they would feel that was perfectly justifiable on pragmatic grounds. That's a really interesting one. I just wanted to ask on that question at the moral superiority one thing I thought was really interesting in that was, it struck me that particularly when you're talking about organizations that have some sort of campaigning focus, the scenarios in which an organization might find that actually it is in the situation where it has to make a determination that it has a better ability to judge moral worth, or when something is just or right, precisely because it feels that the current situation or the way in which a government is acting is not morally right or fair. That will be the case in lots of different examples. Do you is that the sort of scenario that might contribute. I think, in a way it's justifiable, but it could easily tip over into thinking, well, we're campaigning on this issue around gender equality or something like that, but then it becomes culturally a sort of norm that the organization feels that it's able to do that across all different domains, and then finds that actually that tips over into unethical behavior. Is that something that people kind of touched upon?
Yes, and I think it's a very good point that you're raising as well, because in my research, I don't put a normative label to unethical behavior. So I don't say it's good or it's bad. I define unethical behavior simply as going against socially acceptable norms. And again, whether they're legal norms or social norms. So indeed, we do need NGOs, activist advocacy, campaigning NGOs to highlight when the law is wrong. So even if we say that breaking the law is illegal, what if the law in itself is wrong? So we also if we look at the history of NGOs and being able to make a difference in changing laws, policies on equality, for example, it's in large part because NGOs have used their own sense of morals to be able to break the law in order to be able to change the law. So it's very much also looking at how ethics is discussed within an organization, within an NGO. An NGO might think that rule breaking is a necessary means to reach the end of improving on those laws. So moral superiority should not be considered equal as anarchy when you're breaking the rules for the sake of breaking the rules. No, it's for the sake of improving rules and related norms.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that point that it's easy to think that when we're talking about, this sort of behavior or things like moral superiority, that there's a pejorative element, but actually maybe it's an important part of what NGOs do in some context. I just wanted to zoom out and ask you a bit about what obviously this piece of work, I think, has, obvious kind of implications for practitioners, but what your sense is of the current links between practice and academia in the field of philanthropy. I mean, have you found that it's been easy to engage practitioners, both to kind of inform your work and to disseminate it? Or is it, do you think there are kind of structural challenges in doing that?
Amongst practitioners, I've seen that it resonates. I've had some people say, well, now I can articulate this sense of glorification and I can term it the halo effect. In another piece of work, I developed a measurement tool, or like a survey, if you will, to be able to gauge the existence or the strength of the halo within the organization, and also to try and correlate that to unethical behaviors that people in the organization might perceive to exist. So this is almost like a self-reflection tool for organization themselves to be able to see, okay, we are leaning towards this tendency of a halo. And if we do indeed have a halo, how can we then explain some of these unethical behaviors that we might be seeing? From implementing the survey, some of the feedback that I've gotten too is like, we didn't realize that people are perceiving this unethical behavior to exist within the organization. Can this indeed be unpacked and understood by a haloization, if you will, of a mission or the morals or the people behind it? And that's not to say that unethical behavior can only be explained by the halo effect. There are, of course, other factors that can explain it. It's also not a study in causality, because that is very difficult to prove. But for practitioners, being aware of the risk of a halo effect is an important consideration when thinking through how can we mitigate unethical behavior. So in any of these strategizing, foresighting exercises, recognizing that there can be a tendency for glorification can also help people within the NGO be aware of it's a means to be able to prevent, detect, and respond to unethical behavior. So yes, it does have practical implications, this research.
Absolutely, it's really interesting. And then just finally, be really interesting. You mentioned there that this is part of the work that you've been doing for your dissertation, and that you've just defended that as well. So congratulations on that. But just what you're working on now, whether it's more sort of work that follows on from this project, or whether there are kind of other areas that you're also working on at the moment.
Keeping one foot in the academic world and one foot in the practitioner world. My dream, if you will, my mission, vision, is to be more articulate about the need for NGO ethics. A lot of how we, and I say we like in the NGO sense, talk about ethics is still very much borrowed from and leaned from the business ethics discipline. They've been talking about ethics within corporations for the past 30, 40 years. With us, it's still relatively new. And I think with this research, it also comes to show that there can be inherent drivers for unethical behavior or inherent factors that can help us make sense of that. So continuing to research on NGO ethics and be able to translate that and see how NGO ethics lives as a distinct field within practice, hopefully will allow me to be able to better, I don't know if advocate is the right word, but see if there is space for a distinct field on NGO ethics.
Yeah, really interesting to hear. And we'll just remain to say thanks ever so much for finding the time to come on the podcast. Really interesting to hear about the work, and wish you all the best with it in the future.
Thank you so much, Rodney. Again, I look forward to talking to you. It was nice.
Okay, great. Well, my thanks again to Isabel for finding some time to come on the podcast. It was great to hear all about her work, which I'm sure you'll agree was really interesting. And then last but not least for this episode, we have Janis Petzinger. Now, Janis is a research assistant at the University of St Andrews in their Centre for the Study of Philanthropy and Public Good. And her paper is called Pragmatism, Partnerships and Persuasion, Theorizing Philanthropic Foundations in the Global Policy Agora, which is something of a mouthful. And the shorter title again for the research note is Philanthropic Foundations in the Global Policy Arena. So that's very much the kind of thrust of what we were talking about. So without further ado, let's hear from Janis. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Janis Petzinger. Hi there, Janis.
Hi, Rodri.
Well, it's great to have you on the podcast. And yeah, I mean, probably the best place to start is if you could tell everybody listening a bit about the paper that you've got that is featured in the latest ERNOP Research Notes, what it's all about and what the kind of key findings in it are.
Yeah, absolutely. So this paper looks at philanthropic foundations in the global policy agora. So typically scholarship in general has focused on the work of nation states to understand how global policy is created. So policy work is essentially government work, but now scholarship has moved to look at how non-state actors, so private corporations, third sector organizations, and foundations are now entering the global policy field. This is largely because of globalization and just the increase in private money and policy creation in general. This doesn't necessarily mean states are in decline, but it's more the case that now through the realm of global policy work, states are, the term that's frequently used is enmeshing with private actors and blending their work together through partnerships. So this phenomenon of states and non-states sort of mixing together is analogized with the concept of the Greek agora. So that's basically pulls from Athenian history and looks at how in Greece, the agora was essentially a marketplace / public sphere, which, blended commercial and public life and state life. So the agora had the mint. It's where admin duties took place for different court work. But it also had shops, shrines. So it's kind of the heart of intellectual in public life and discourse. So essentially what this paper looks at is uses this analogy of the Greek agora to look at how foundations are operating in the global policy agora, basically working in this marketplace of policy and using their influence in this policy space, bringing their own forms of knowledge, their own ideas about how change should happen in society at a wider level. And exercising their great influence.
And what are some of the kind of key roles that you identify foundations playing in that policy agora? Because I guess the question in my mind and other people's minds is when you think about the context for international policy, I mean, pragmatically, even the biggest foundations are not operating on the scale of governments when it comes to straightforward expenditure. So they're probably not kind of competing in terms of pure money flows. What roles do you see them as filling in that space?
So the most common role is what's typically referred to as the soft transfer of policy. So you're totally right. They're not frequently, they might not be at the head of the table all of the time, but the sort of private money sphere that foundations are operating in tend to create these sort of soft forms of policy that take place in just the sharing of knowledge or like the creation of standards, for example. So there's the NET FWD, which is basically a group of foundations that work for the OECD, which basically sets standards, market-related standards for how foundations work in global policy work. They're not participating in the hard policy, like changing laws, but they're basically creating a culture of how different governments can think about their approach to any kind of program, essentially. And they also work as conveners in different spaces. So Michael Moran looked at this in 2011 with a great article on the Rockefeller Foundation and how in the 1980s, basically money had dried up for different research on diseases such as HIV or tuberculosis, because at that point in the West, research tend to focus on health in the realms of, cardiovascular disease. So the Rockefeller Foundation knew that there was this gap in research and then used their offices in Lombardy to basically convene a bunch of different research groups. And that essentially led to different vaccine development overseas, which then led to different government contracts, et cetera. So they're doing a lot of convening as well as just setting standards about how policy should happen.
And in terms of the sorts of foundations we're talking about, I guess you mentioned Rockefeller there, and I guess immediately in people's minds it would be organizations of the scale of Rockefeller or the Gates Foundation or Children's Investment Fund Foundation. Mm-hmm. Is it primarily that kind of foundation operating that sort of scale, or is there a kind of meaningful role for smaller foundations as well in the sort of global policy agora?
Yeah, there is a meaningful role with smaller foundations. I guess when we talk about global policy, we're talking about big policy in general, typically. That's what the scholarship is looking at here. So a lot of research has been done on like these mega foundations, especially on like the Open Society Foundation and the work that they do. I think also the sort of tapering down of foundation size can happen within the same project. So the Rockefeller Foundation will frequently be working with smaller local foundations within a specific place, for example. So smaller foundations and charities definitely play a role, but it seems like in general, they're kind of subsumed by these big mega foundations, especially when we're looking at, big policy. The global agora is interesting because typically, if we look at the sort of the Greek history there, it in theory was a public space for everyone to participate in and be a part of, but the people with the most money and the loudest voices tend to have the biggest influence in that space. So it is a public sphere where everyone is included in theory, but whether that's actually what's happening is a different question.
Yeah, and I guess some relatively obvious echoes from history there for the current context. Just sort of getting for a minute into the nitty gritty of the paper as well, although maybe let's not sort of dive too much into it. But one of the things that you do in it is try and kind of look at how we understand the role of foundations by applying a sort of theoretical framework. You term French pragmatic sociology of critique in it, which I thought was really interesting. And particularly the thing that really sort of sprung out at me from that was where you talk about the idea of different grammars of worth or sort of orders of worth that can be applied. Could you just say a bit about that idea? Because I think that will really resonate with people.
Yeah, absolutely. So French pragmatic sociology is a non-structuralist way to look at philanthropic foundations. It moves beyond this sort of like typological view that there are different types of foundations that do different kinds of activities, or the critical theory view that sees foundations as basically organizations with heavy power and lots of resources, and they exercise their power in different ways. French pragmatic sociology kind of sits between these things and looks at how foundations are fundamentally pragmatic organizations. And they're pragmatic because they are filled with everyday people and actors who are constantly facing different uncertain questions about how to exercise their philanthropy. And through this sort of experience of being pragmatic, people that work in foundations pull from different political philosophies. So that's what Boltanski, who basically is the founder of French pragmatic sociology, he referred to this as the grammars of worth. So it's basically the idea that any organization in general is inherently political. That's political with like a lowercase p. And that happens because any organization pulls from certain ideologies, right? And the grammars of worth are kind of a scaffolding of these different kinds of political ideologies that people can pull from. And the basic idea here is that these political ideologies are traced back to different political philosophy texts. So Boltanski argues that organizations can take on a market grammar of worth, which basically reflects ideas of Adam Smith, an inspired grammar of worth, which basically relates to singularity and creativeness, tied to the work of St. Augustine in the City of God. There's a domestic grammar of worth, which is related to esteem, reputation, and relationships and trust. And that's from Rousseau's Politics. There's a civic grammar of worth, which ties to the idea of collective welfare, and that goes back to Rousseau's Social Contract. An industrial grammar of worth, which relates to technical efficiency, which ties to St. Simon's theories of industrial systems. And then finally, there's a fame grammar of work related to renown, which ties to Hobbes. So basically, the argument here is that everyday actors in organizations use their own critical reflexivity to pull from any sort of normative form, any sort of political grammar in this Grammars of Worth list. So this list came together in 2006 in the seminal On Justification that Boltanski wrote with his co-author Thévenot. But this is since the Grammars of Worth has since been updated into a new grammar of political philosophy that they put forward in their book, The New Spirit of Capitalism. And that basically argues that now this sort of prevailing grammar that's happening is a project-based grammar. So now within the system of capitalism that works on contracts, works on public-private partnerships, now organizations justify their work, maybe alongside these other grammars that I mentioned, but mostly on the fact that projects are in themselves sources of value. So project-based work is a grammar now, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I'm particularly the project bit at the end, because there's quite a long-standing critique of sort of projectism, as I know it's been called in the foundation world. And I just wondered, just to finish on that thought, the thing it made me think was, I'm sure anyone who works in the NGO space or in foundations will be kind of, even if they don't know the terminology of grammars of worth, the idea that you present your work in different ways, potentially to different audiences by using different forms of justification, will feel quite familiar. I just wondered, in your perception of whether when foundations do that, it kind of reflects fundamentally a sort of pragmatism because they're just trying to find more effective ways of speaking to particular audiences, or whether it reflects something more fundamental about their kind of ideological nature and what it is that they actually believe about the world.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm not sure if foundations can even answer that themselves.
No, probably not.
I think that, realistically, I think that it's a bit of both. I think if we look at foundations at sort of an everyday level, if we were to walk into a room and saw people on a board conducting their grant making, I think we'd see a lot of examples of them pulling from different political philosophies, right? So a foundation might want to fund an organization because they reflect a sort of civic idea of participation and getting people in a community working again. But at the same time, they're going to look at their finances and see how well they're doing and how, for lack of a better word, industrious they're being or cost effective they're being, right? So I think a point of this is to basically show that foundations pull from more than one ideology in their everyday work. So typically when we think of foundations in the global agora, we're framing them alongside the idea of markets and neoliberalism and how that ideology is fed into their work. And that's definitely true, but there is more complexity in terms of what their ideologies are sort of at the heart. But at the same time, equally to your question, the first part of it, which I think speaks to this sort of critical suspicion that, we might have sometimes of foundations, like, are they being honest about what they're doing, or are these just empty words? can we trust foundations when they say that they are creating trust-based relationships with people on the ground? We can essentially usually only take their word for it. And in the empirical example that I use in my paper, it shows that no, there's a ton of reasons why we should be suspicious of the sort of PR that mega foundations put out there. And just because they are saying one thing, that does not necessarily mean that it's true. So essentially, the grammars of worth are meant to both show the complexity of these ideologies within their practices, but also show how they can be weaponized as a way to market themselves, more or less.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I just wanted to zoom out for a minute and just before I let you go, kind of ask for your perceptions of the sort of wider question of how academia currently links up with practice in the field of philanthropy, because obviously the focus of all this research note series with the ERNOP and these podcasts is to kind of explore that space and the connections between them. How have you found that so far? Have you found it easy to engage with practitioners, both to inform your work and disseminating it, or have you found that there are challenges there?
There are a lot of challenges. I find it really challenging. I do. I think that, to pull from this sort of grammars of worth even, I find that we're speaking different languages pretty often. So I feel like what my job has been doing, what I've been doing in my work, especially as I work very closely with my funders at the Rank Foundation and consult on some of their practices. I have found my work to essentially be an emissary between academia and practice quite often. And that means finding the right language. And that is more difficult than I would have thought prior to entering academia. And it really requires academics, I think, to take a look at some taken for granted assumptions. Not many practitioners, I think practitioners can relate, as you said, to these grammars of worth, but talking about post-structuralism, French pragmatism, that's not helpful to them.
It requires putting in a different form, I think, so that the basic ideas get across. Because as I say, I do think they speak to people and they would get them. But as you say, when the language often differs and the conceptual frameworks differ, maybe that gets a bit lost.
Absolutely. Equally, though, I think that something that I would like to see more of in the practice space is the use of theory and being really sort of centering theory as a piece of as a way to guide us in our practices, because I feel like that's something when we do practices in philanthropy, sometimes we become unanchored and just see the thing in front of us. But theoretical frameworks remind us that, no matter what kind of philanthropy we do, we are operating with a specific point of view. And I think academia can help bring that to practice a bit more. It just needs to, find the right way to say it. And then beyond that, I really struggle with the fact that, and we talked about this before we started recording, academia moves at a completely different pace. I wrote this paper in this time last year, actually. I submitted the first draft, and then it finally got published in August 2023. And things change so fast, and peer review just does not keep up with that. I don't know. I don't know what to do about that.
And that's a relatively quick turnaround, I think.
Massively quick. I was really lucky.
And on which note, I just wanted, before I let you go, just to ask, given that, kind of, what are you working on now? Because obviously, as you say, this paper in a way is something you did a year or so ago.
Yeah. Right now, I'm working with the Rank Foundation, looking at data that they have from some surveys that they've taken with their beneficiary network, essentially on the cost of living crisis, and looking at how organizations, typically when we think of the cost of living crisis, we think about its impact on households. I'm looking at how it's impacted charities and how they are facing demand. And it's pretty dark picture right now. The sector, I've really been diving into more so like the charity phenomenon right now of like trying to do more with less, and unpacking what we call like a bidirectional relationship of struggle in organizations, whereby the demand from the cost of living crisis is asking more of charities, but because charities can't give as much as they maybe have in the past, that increases the demand. So we're stuck in this bidirectional cycle. So I'm unpacking that a bit more within the UK sphere and seeing what important lessons can be pulled out of that.
Well, it'd be really interesting to hear, and I'm sure, again, lots of people will unfortunately have experience of that, because I know it's a challenge facing lots of organisations right now.
Yeah.
We just remain to say thanks ever so much, Janis, for finding time to come on the podcast. It's really interesting to hear about the work and what you're doing now, and hopefully we might have a chance to talk in a bit more depth at some point in the future.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant. Thank you. I'm a big fan of the podcast.
Oh, thank you. Okay, great. Well, my thanks again to Janis and to Arthur and to Isabel for finding time to come on the podcast. It was great to hear all about their work. I will put links in the show notes, as usual, to places where you can find both the research note and the original articles that they were based on. I'll also put some places where you might be able to find a bit more information about other work that they've all done. And if I can find any relevant links to past editions of this podcast or things that I've written on Why Philanthropy Matters, I'll make sure to put links to those too. If you're interested more broadly in issues around philanthropy and civil society, Why Philanthropy Matters is a great place to start, I think. There's a real growing amount of content there on the website now. Some would say almost an overwhelming amount, but there's lots of articles. There's all the back issues of this podcast. There's news updates on all kinds of things. There's an archive of the newsletter that I do every month, and so do check that out. If you've got ideas for people that I could talk to on the podcast or topics that we could cover in future, please do drop me a line. That's definitely produced fruit on a number of occasions when people have suggested themselves or others, and that's ended up leading to really, really interesting conversations. And I should say we've got some great episodes lined up. I'm not going to spoil the surprise, but I was involved in the conversations and I've heard them, and they're really, really interesting. So do keep an eye out over the coming weeks and months for those. If you want to follow more broadly what I'm doing, follow me on social media. Definitely the best place these days is LinkedIn. You can just about find me on Twitter or X, but I'm not really using it for very much, like I think most people these days. Other than that, just follow the podcast, share with other people. If you've got colleagues or friends that you think might be interested in the podcast or in the work of Why Philanthropy Matters, do point them in my direction. And, the more the merrier. And I will see you next time. Bye!